All right, today we are talking about marine ecosystems and estuary ecosystems. So, estuaries are where rivers meet the sea. So, right in this area right here. So, it's a mix of fresh water and salt water. So, if you remember, salt water is classified as anything less than 0.5% salinity, and ocean water is anything with greater than 30% salinity. So everything in the estuary zone is in between those two salinities, and actually salinities can get much higher than 30% due to evaporations, because we can have water that gets trapped in little ponds and does not have any tidal influence, so it just evaporates and the salt stays while the water leaves. It encompasses both deep water habitats and wetlands. So wetlands would be like salt marshes and seagrass habitats, and these areas are really highly productive. They are home to organisms like oysters and seagrasses. It provides a nursery habitat for lots of small fish and lots of fish and crabs and things that we eat as seafood. It also is a wonderful habitat for birds, so these areas are very important to bird watchers. And so after we get out of the estuary, we're now into the marine environments. So let's take a look really quickly at estuaries in North Carolina before we move on. Okay, in North Carolina, our estuaries, we call them sounds. So here is a picture of two of our larger sounds, the Albemarle Sound and the Pamlico Sound. Our estuaries are behind our barrier islands, so our barrier islands are this chain of islands right here. So it provides kind of a physical barrier for the ocean water to meet the river water, and we have several rivers. The Tar-Pamlico River is coming into the Pamlico Sound, as is the Neuse River. The Cape Fear River is further south, and then further north we have the Chuan River and the Roanoke River coming into the Albemarle Sound. And our estuaries in North Carolina are really productive habitats and really important for our fisheries economy, especially blue crab production and oyster production. Okay, so in the marine environments, we have the neritic zone. Before we have the neritic zone, we have the tidal zone. And in the tidal area, that's the area between low and high tide. So here's our high tide line, and here's our low tide line. So it's all of the area in between here. So these areas are also called our shore habitats, and they can be either rocky or sandy. In North Carolina, we have sandy shores. Out west in the Pacific Northwest and also in the Atlantic Northeast, we have rocky coasts, which are very, very different ecosystems, and very, very different groups of organisms live there. So all of these organisms have to withstand periods of wet and dry, because we have the tide coming in and flooding things and then going back out and leaving areas very dry. So that's a pretty unique adaptation that they have to have. So we find things like sea stars and urchins, barnacles, crabs, algae, and lichens here. These areas are exposed to sunlight all the time, so there's no problem with photosynthesis here. Then we move into the neritic zone. So that is also called the coastal zone. This area is always covered with water, so it's from the low tide line to the edge of the continental shelf. And so these areas are always covered with water, and they get to be about approximately 200 meters deep in depth. They always have sunlight, so photosynthetic organisms can live there, and that's the basis of their food chain. And there's pretty limited tidal action. Like we said, they're always flooded. They're always covered with water. So in this area, we're going to find organisms like fish, some phytoplankton, maybe even some kelps, and turtles and jellies and all sorts of really cool sea creatures that are very charismatic and that humans tend to like. Then we move out into the pelagic zone or the open ocean zone. So this is divided up by light and depth. So it's anything beyond the continental shelf. And it's the largest habitat on Earth, so that makes it really important. The first zone that we're going to talk about is the photic zone. It goes from the surface to about 200 meters deep. And the photic zone, light penetrates the entire layer. There's lots of phytoplankton, which are our primary producers in the ocean. And they're little photosynthetic organisms that live in the photic zone. And they are the basis of the food chain there. In very clear waters, it goes down to about 200 meters. In very turbid waters, or waters that are kind of murky looking where the sun can't penetrate as far, these zones are a little bit shallower. Then we move down to the baffle zone, which is 200 meters down to about 4,000 meters. And in the baffle zone, there is almost no light. And as you go down, the pressure increases because the weight of the water above you is just pushing down. And so as you go further down, there's more water on top, so that pressure increases. Levels of oxygen are dropping off. So our oxygen is decreasing. And there are no vegetation or photosynthesis. So the food chains in this zone are based on either getting organisms that swim between the photic and the benthic zone, or detritus, so dead matter that's falling. So that's what our food chains are based on in the baffle zone. And here we start to get some crazier looking critters. All right, here's just an example of a couple of the critters that we get in the baffle zone. So we get things like, this is a baffle swimming crab right here, what is this, vampire squid, and an anglerfish. So if you notice, they are all in very, very dark background, so there's no light there. Then we move on to the abyssal zone, which is 4,000 to 6,000 meters. There's absolutely no light here. There's very low oxygen and extremely high pressure, which is a huge challenge for organisms to cope with. The food webs are all based on detritus falling from the upper zones, and there is some chemosynthesis occurring here, so at the deep sea vents. So that means that organisms are taking in chemicals other than carbon dioxide and sunlight and using those to generate energy. And that can be a basis for the food web as well. And then below 600 meters, we get to the hyatal zone. And then anything that actually lives in the sediment is called the benthic zone. The benthic zone is anything in the sediment at any depth. So it spans from the continental shelf all the way down the continental slope to the abyssal zone. So, all right. That is our overview of marine ecology. There is a ton more to dig into, and we'll try to do our best to dig in.